And joining us now in studio, David Mirvish, producer and founder of Mirvish Productions. Hello, pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Pia.
Okay, we have one of Canada's foremost theatre producers in the chair, and so I want to look with you at the state of Canadian theatre. You founded your theatre production company, Mirvish Productions, back in the late 80s.
86.
86. What was the first show you mounted?
The first show was The Real Thing. And that season, there wasn't a great deal coming out of Broadway, but my father had built a great subscription. Toronto, he had believed that theatre was a habit and that you needed to have something on in the theatre all the time. And he bought the Royal Alexandra Theatre in 1963, and he kept it open. So by 1986, he had a big subscription base, and we weren't seeing the types of shows we thought were worthy of the audience. So I said, could we try to produce 2 or 3 of them? And I went to a production of Cloud 9 up at the Playhouse Theatre, and I thought it was brilliant. It was Bill Glasgow directed it, and there were 2 young people, Ernie Schwartz and Brian Sewell, who had produced it. So I went to them and I said, would you produce a show for me? And we settled on a Tom Stoppard play, The Real Thing, and they produced it, and I went to 2 other teams of people who also produced shows for me. We did The Mikado, and we also, from Stratford, which Brian McDonald did, and we did Damn Yankees with Marlene Smith and Ernie Rubinstein, and all 3 of them were a success. So I thought we should be producing 1 or 2 shows a year in every subscription season.
You said that there weren't shows that were worthy of an audience for the audience. What do you mean by that?
Well, sometimes in any world there's a lull. There's a moment when there's not as much going on in that world as one would wish. And theatre was in the midst of change. 2 years later, Les Miserables came on the scene. It was the first sung-through musical. It changed the style of musicals. Also, in the period leading up to that, when shows were successful in New York, a lesser version was taken to other cities, one that could move quickly from city to city, that wasn't as expensive to build. And Cameron Mackintosh changed all that. When he did Les Mis and decided to take it to other cities, he wanted to take it at the same level of quality that he had done in New York. And so you had to stay 4, 5, 6 weeks minimum to justify the expenses of moving that big a production. But it changed the whole nature of North American theatre outside of New York.
Well, tell me about the change in the 26 years, 1986 to now, about the theatre-going public's appetite since '86.
Well, I think it starts with the playwrights. It starts with the creative forces. What has happened is people have discovered that they can make a living in the theatre, that they can write for theatre, and that they can have great success, and that they can have a type of freedom that they don't have maybe writing in other fields. I think journalists have, a certain amount of freedom, but people writing for the movies have a lot of people to answer to, and they're never sure if their picture's going to get produced, and it's never going to really reflect exactly their vision. Whereas in the theatre, the creative people have a lot of say. So it became very attractive for people to write to theatre. The other part of it was that a show like Cats ran around the world for 30 years and still is running and has done over $3 billion business. So somewhere along there, the writer was able to make a living. And I think that inspired other people to be involved in theatre.
And for the audience, how have their types changed in that quarter of a century?
The audiences, for mass theatre, it was always that audiences liked musicals first, comedy second, and dramas third. And that beyond that, if it was a comedy or a drama, they wanted to see actors in real life that they couldn't see otherwise. So they always looked towards stars. So the West End and New York Broadway has always been driven that way. But that's not all the story of theatre. We have 3 theatres in Toronto that are writers' theatres: Tarragon, Passe Muraille, and Factory Lab, Factory Theatre. And there's Canadian Stage with many places. There are many outlets for people to get their story out. And a lot of it's very good, very interesting, very engaging. So you have to look at a totality.
There seems to be, though, modern trends in theaters. The prominence of puppetry as a way to tell the story. Why do you think we are seeing more of that? You talked about stars on Broadway, but now we're seeing puppets being the stars. Why are we seeing that?
I think that the visual surprise is something that we engage with. I don't know that we anticipate it. Who would have thought that you could make a show like Warhorse, where the puppets actually behave in such a way that you believe them to be horses, and in fact they are. They're very sensitive, they're very responsive, but these are puppets that breathe, that you can feel and hear their breath.
Or puppets like in Avenue Q, which are more like Sesame Street puppets.
Which also is an extraordinarily creative surprise, and who teach us. Unfortunately, they teach us things that maybe we don't want to know, like the internet may be for porn, but that's one of the lessons of Avenue Q. I think that what is interesting about Warhorse is that could never have been done in the commercial theater. I don't think a commercial producer would have come along and said, I've seen this great puppet company in South Africa, and I'd like to make a show around that. I wonder what I could use. Well, maybe I could use a book that was written for children originally, for 11 and 12 and 14-year-olds. And then, okay, we're going to take months to see how we do this and try to figure it out. So here the National Theatre of Great Britain takes this risk, and they come up with a story that communicates with people all over the world. We have our own story of a war horse here in Canada. The 48th Highlanders. In the First World War, there was a horse that was captured on the Russian front and by the Germans, and they brought it to the Western Front, and it was captured by the Canadians just before the end of the war. The soldier who captured that horse died just before coming home, but the colonel of the regiment took the horse and the company mascot home with him to Nova Scotia. And just the other day, his family heard about the show. Some of his family was in Vancouver, and they said, we have that same story as the story of the English have. We'd like to get in touch with the 48th Highlanders. Our grandfather was head of that regiment and served there the last 2 years of the war, and we'd like to give them his uniform. And so in the officers' mess at the annual dinner this year, the uniform was presented, and the whole Brent family surrounded that, came to that dinner, and the regimental leaders were all there. And you could see in the sleeve there was a tear, and he had been wounded twice, and the tear symbolized that. And his granddaughter, who was 7 when he passed away, could remember the shrapnel wounds on his neck on the left side. So there are all sorts of ways of communicating, of bringing people together, that these stories surprise us with.
In addition to being a theater producer, you also have expertise in the visual arts. How does that influence the way that you approach theater?
Well, I started out as an art dealer. In 1963, I opened a gallery, and I did that for 15 years and had held regular exhibitions, and I thought there would be some crossover. What I discovered is that there was very little crossover. Occasionally, in the world of opera, visual artists are invited to make the sets. And I tried an experiment in the Old Vic when in those days, I don't think it is still true, but you used to have to show the fire curtain between acts to prove that people were safe in the theater. And I thought, let's create a fire curtain that would be more interesting than just the words. So I went to Ron Kitai, who was an American living in London, and he painted this extraordinary painting of the Waterloo Road and turned it into a tree of life and held the Old Vic in its branches. And Lillian Bayliss, who had turned to Shakespeare in desperation at the turn of the century and to save the Old Vic and had put on all 37 plays of Shakespeare, one after the other, was flying across the sky with angel wings, and Edgar Allan Poe was reciting The Raven down in the right-hand corner, and the bird was flying through the window. But in the end, we didn't end up creating the curtain because we realized that it might interrupt the story that we were already telling and that maybe we shouldn't be intruding. In the end, though, we did end up with the painting, and it's now in my office, so I'm delighted to have the painting.
And there is, as you see it, differences between a viewer's relationship with the performing arts and with the visual arts, yes?
I don't know. I think people who are curious can respond to it all. If you know, we don't all go to the symphony and the opera and the musical theater and plays and art galleries and museums, but they're all out there for us, and they're all part of what makes our lives more interesting, as does baseball and hockey. And you know, I think that the divide isn't so much whether it's a divide about whether or not we like to leave our home, if we're willing to go out for dinner, if we want to engage with other people and have conversation. The theater stimulates you to engage. You go to see something, and if it was really exciting, you want to talk about it, so you don't go right to bed. You end up going out for coffee, and you end up, you know, having a conversation.
Some would argue that modern theater also allows for a lot of debate after the show, and I'm thinking of Avenue Q and other examples that really have been tackling maybe what some would describe as taboo subject matter through cheery song and dance. So for those people who haven't seen Avenue Q, I just want to play a little bit of a clip from it so people can get a taste of it. Let's take a look.
Good.
Everyone's a little bit racist. All right, all right, all right, all right. Bigotry has never been exclusively white. If we all could just admit that we are racist a little bit, even though we all know that it's wrong, maybe it would help us get along.
Okay, David, everybody's a little bit racist, you know, big smile on their faces, and yet a subject that we wouldn't have heard about 10 or 15 years ago in the theater. What do we have?
Well, I don't know. You might have seen it in the theater. I don't know if if you would see it as widely distributed as it is now through a musical. You know, you might have seen it in Raisin in the Sun and some of the plays that we saw 40 years ago.
But were mainstream audiences ready for it a decade ago,
I don't know if mainstream audiences are ready for anything. I'm about to do Book of Mormon, and it's South Park. And that should be a warning enough.
Okay, I went to New York to see Book of Mormon. I'm a big fan. I'm just laying it out there. And I want to talk about that production because it's coming up in your upcoming season. For people who don't know what Book of Mormon is about, give us a brief synopsis.
Well, it's about these young people who have been at Bible school and are now 19, and it's time for them to go out into the world and share their feelings. And one of them, you know, without, I hope, ruining the story for you, feels that, you know, he was top of his class, and the best place for the Lord to send him to do his work would be Orlando. But instead he ends up in Uganda, and he goes with another classmate, and they're there to instruct the natives, and in the process I think they're instructed. And we learn a little bit about the Mormon religion, but it's not really just, it's not about the Mormon religion. It's about all religions. It's about our ability to have faith, I think, beyond, in a trusting way, beyond having to have it proven. And there are a lot of times in life when we do take that sort of leap, not just about religion, but about ideas that we intuitively feel are right, and they're tested. And sometimes we fail, and sometimes we succeed. But yes, this show's going to test my audience's limits.
Let's test a little bit. I think we're going to show a clip of this. Is the Broadway cast at the Tonys this past year.
I believe that the Lord God created the universe. I believe that he sent his only son to die for my sins. And I believe that ancient Jews built boats and sailed to America. I am a Mormon, and a Mormon just believes.
I gotta tell you, I have the soundtrack from the musical. I listen to my car giggle most of the way while I'm driving, which I suppose is part of the goal.
If the theater can make people think through giggling, giggling's a great device. I love it.
There are those, of course, who have been quite critical of the Book of Mormon, saying that, you know, the creators, the South Park guys, misrepresented Mormon missionaries. What do you make of that criticism?
You know, I'm not an expert on Mormon missionaries. I don't see it as critical of Mormons. I actually see it as sort of supportive of all religion in a strange way. But would I have put this show into my subscription if it hadn't won all the Tonys? I would have had some real trepidation. And the only thing that I do feel is that it's not making fun of people. Ultimately, it's pointing out absurdities in our lives and different, you know, ways of seeing things. But I don't believe that it's belittling anybody.
Is part of the appeal of Book of Mormon, of Avenue Q and the like, is it partially because they're so provocative?
I think partially, and I think partially because there's always little truths. I mean, that's, are we all a little prejudiced? Maybe there is something in that, and maybe it's a little warning to all of us to say, well, was that a response that we thought out, or was that a response that we just grew up in a certain environment in a certain time? People who were older than me, you know, many of them passed away now, said things that today would not be acceptable. And yet, were they bad people? I don't know that they were. I just think that was the environment they grew up in and the language that was around them, and they didn't really mean to hurt people or mean, you know, would we accept it today? We'd say something to them. We wouldn't accept those words. You know, so all these shows sort of put us on our guard to think, and there's nothing wrong with thinking. It's better than not thinking.
Now that it's unacceptable, I mean, has it given us room to sort of tackle these big issues in musical theater through song and dance?
Yes, through song and dance of all strange.
I mean, people who, you know, grew up with Oklahoma couldn't project probably that we were going to see the Avenue Qs in the Book of Mormons.
We're no longer having to tell the stories in 240-seat theaters. We're telling it in 2,000-seat theaters because the public is much more diversified and also much more accepting to look at themselves and think about these things. It's actually a compliment to where we've gotten to so far. And, you know, we can't get smug about it, but we can say, maybe we're going in the right direction.
Trey Parker, the creator of South Park, and Matt Stone, they wrote the Book of Mormon. There are other musicals that have been successful based on TV and film. Is that sort of, is there a need to have film musicals rooted in TV and film to be successful?
It's a big question because the more original the work is and the newer it is, the better, I think, because when it succeeds, it's such a surprise. It's something that we have no familiarity with, or it comes to us new. But if you want to reach a very large audience, you need to start out with people in the seats. And if you are asking them to come to something without a star, written by people who no one knows, about a story that they've never heard of, you will not fill, you know, 1,500 seats or 2,000 seats. You have to do that in 100 seats and build up. So everything has its own path, but the show that has the most Tony nominations this year is a musical called Once, and it's a very small, delicate, very personal reaction between two people who find a supportive role with each other, and it's a wonderful musical. And people come to me and they say, this is perfect, and yet it's not what we think of as Broadway musical at all.
Because we think of Broadway musicals as maybe the Mamma Mia's, the Rock of Ages, things that we're more familiar with.
Big, and stories that we're more familiar with. Now, Once was a movie, but it was a very small movie that not many people saw. So, yes, it still had a little help, but it started out in a small off-Broadway theater in New York, and people just so embraced it, you couldn't get tickets. It was a limited run, and so they moved it onto Broadway.
And now we're seeing Once and Spring Awakening.
Yes, Spring Awakening's a tough show. It's one that one wouldn't, Vaindekin, when he wrote it as a play, actually couldn't put it on at the time he wrote it. I think it was 16 years until it got put on for the first production. So
It's got a particular scene that audiences
some very
have,
tough
yeah.
scenes, but adolescence is a tough time. None of us want to live through our adolescence again.
Speaking of adolescence, that's a good segue, because there was a young woman, I can't remember her name, you'll have to remind me, that won the role of Maria in The Sound of Music through a TV reality show. What was her name again?
Alicia McKenzie.
Alicia McKenzie. Okay. You are now doing this again. You are casting for Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz through a TV show. Is this another way to generate interest in theater, attaching it to TV?
Well, from my point of view, absolutely. The TV reaches a much broader audience, and it goes all across the country. But it's a great gamble, and we happen to have been great winners. So we went to the roulette table once. We found a star. Alicia not only played in The Sound of Music as Maria, but she went on to play in 2 other large shows of ours that went on for several years, and I'm sure that we're going to hear from her again. She is a star, and TV helped us to make her known that way. So I'm hopeful that we'll be successful in finding a Dorothy.
What's the biggest gamble in doing this?
Well, the biggest gamble is we don't get to choose. The public chooses, especially as we get down to the last 3 choices. It really is all in the hands of the public. But, they did it right the first time, and ultimately, we like to believe that the public knows best. So there's only one time, I think, when it didn't succeed, and that was when they tried to do Grease in America, and they were trying to find a male and female lead who not only were capable of the singing, dancing, and acting, which is tough enough, but they also had chemistry together. And I think the public wasn't able to put that part together. So so we're very careful what shows we would ever consider doing this with, and there are very few of them that we would.
We have about 5 minutes left. I want to talk about other Toronto theatre, particularly Dancap, which closed recently. I want to read you something from the Globe and Mail. This is what writer J. Kelly Nestruck had to say about the closing of Dancap Productions back in May. It's panic time in Canadian theatre, with this week's announcement that Toronto's Dancap Productions will be shutting down following the recent demise of the Vancouver Playhouse. The health of the country's theatre ecology, commercial and not-for-profit, is being pronounced in critical condition. Carrying on, however, is not a good idea. If we don't examine these losses with a clear eye, we might end up perpetuating models that no longer enrich the country or theatre producers. David Mirvish, what do you make of that argument?
I think that everyone has their own personal relationship to how they deal with theater. I think that people who are involved, there are many committed people. I believe that Dancap will possibly come back to the theater. I don't think that they've left forever necessarily. I don't think that theater is in trouble. I think theater actually is very healthy. We've had shifts in Toronto because once upon a time we had many more American visitors than we once did, but we've compensated by doing shows for shorter runs, but more shows, and we've looked further afield. So there is great theater going on around the world. We're part of that story and part of that discussion. But what has changed in my own way of looking at the theater is I used to wait and see what succeeded in New York or London, and then looked into my own community and added into that so that I could create a whole package of activity. Now, in addition to that, I go out and I look to see what's happening in London or Paris or New York before it succeeds, and I'm a part of that. And I'm investing in those shows, and I'm investing in shows all over the world. So we sent someone to Iceland this week, someone was in Australia, and they're back today. We have shows that we're invested in Australia. We did something in Oslo the other day. So we're looking at theater everywhere, and we're saying Toronto has a great audience. we can bring it from anywhere in the world if we can bring the right show. And Toronto can be part of the story, but we have to look at these shows not just for Toronto, but for Toronto and London, Toronto and New York. And if we can find and develop new work, then Toronto will be exciting. But I also think our own community, we have so many talented people. You have to look there, and you have to look at Shaw and Stratford, who are drawing, creating a whole package. No one person owns the theatre. I can tell you, there's lots of room for everybody.
I'm curious, when you go around the world and look at productions, I'm guessing you're not only looking at what's happening on stage, but also you're looking at the audience. So make that comparison for me. What's unique about Canadian theatre-going audiences?
I think we like going out. I think we like having fun, actually. And fun can be a real tough evening, even, of something that, wasn't all musical or laugh and giggles, but it can be something that stimulates us to think. And the characteristic of Toronto as a city is its diversity. It's a banking city, it's a medical city, it's a university city, it's a place of arts, it's a place of sports. We have a new art gallery addition, we have a new renovation of the ROM, we have a new addition to the Ceramic Museum. That's what makes a city. It's all the components, and any one of them dominating would be a mistake. I have some concerns about the $4 billion casino that we're talking about. Not because I'm against gambling. I think doctors should live and have good jobs, and there'll probably be lots of patients that'll come out of it. But my feeling is that a $4 billion casino will suck all the entertainment dollars into it, and it will then take away from the theaters and from the art galleries, and the restaurants surrounding them will suffer. And I don't think it's good for a city. I do think that gambling in some form, it exists in London or Paris, but New York hasn't found a need for it. New York has lived without it. So these are things that communities have to examine. They have to decide how they want to brand themselves, how they want to be known. Do they want to be known, for a gambling casino, or do they want to be known for a diversified society?
That is a perfect segue to our conversation tomorrow, where we'll be talking about Toronto and our cultural institutions. But thank you for joining me tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.